As G7 leaders gather in the Canadian Rockies to discuss the most pressing international issues, the ongoing conflict between Israel and Iran will certainly top the summit's agenda. This, however, further complicates the situation for Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy, who still counts on more pressure to be put on Russia. And to discuss the impact of the conflict in the Middle East on Europe, we're joined by Jarosław Ćwiek-Karpowicz, Director of the Polish Institute of International Affairs. Good evening.
Good evening.
So, what can Volodymyr Zelenskyy expect from this meeting with Donald Trump, if it happens, in fact, given that the US attention has shifted towards the Middle East? And, Trump stated not that long ago that during his last phone call with Vladimir Putin, he has once again urged the Russian leader to stop the invasion of Ukraine.
As far as I remember, it would be the third meeting. The first one very famous in Washington, D.C., in not very pleasant atmosphere. Yeah. The second one in Rome during the funeral of Pope, and the third time in person. Of course, many phone calls. I hope that President Zelenskyy would gain some sort of guarantee that the US will continue with military support, because what already is in Ukraine, I mean the US equipment and technical support, surveillance, was planned already before the inauguration of Donald Trump as a president. And frankly speaking, probably Ukraine needs more military staff, not only from Europe but also from the United States, for further, let's say, war with Russia for next month. And I'm not quite sure if the public opinion will be informed about the concrete declaration, but definitely for Ukraine it's important to have support from both sides, from Europe and from America.
Well, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has already stated that this military support will be visibly lower in 2026. So do you think something can change Donald Trump's mind?
I mean, still it's a long time and long promises. And as we observe how Trump is changing his mind about tariffs, it's even not days, but during hours, declaration about next year or the next after, it's a very, very, let's say, not obligatory, definitely, for the White House. Trump very often make impression that he is personally involved, and then he distances himself from the negotiation, like that he's upset that both sides, Russia and Ukraine, are not willing to make some progress. But we should clearly state that for US, this conflict is not the existential threat. There are no US soldiers who are involved directly, so there are not political costs for Donald Trump. The only thing which some people may remind him is that he promised
to end this war.
Yes, but he might simply said, I did my best, but unfortunately they didn't listen my advices. So it's not the most important thing from, let's say, the political promises of Donald Trump towards Americans. I think that much more important is the domestic policy and what Trump promised to US citizens. First of all, increase of their economic income and welfare, and this is something what is completely out of the peace negotiation between Russia and Ukraine.
Can Volodymyr Zelenskyy count on more sanctions to be announced at the end, I guess, of the G7 summit, given Donald Trump's reluctance so far?
G7 is a group which, let's say, lead the sanction policy, and very often US and EU sanctions are followed what G7 countries already decide. And also Trump very often said about very serious sanctions, and on the same time he promised that one step and all sanctions would be lifted. It's a mechanism. It's not so easy to lift all sanctions one day. I think that sanctions are playing in US interest as well, because mostly they hit Russian energy revenues and Russian oil and the gas. In this regard, as we remember, Donald Trump during his campaign said about exploration of crude oil and natural gas in the United States as much as it's possible. So in this regard, having Russia under the sanction regime together with Iran, it's quite good for oil and gas sector in the United States. So I think that in this regard, the G7 leaders may reach some consensus.
Will there be a $45 price cap on Russian crude oil?
This is what we heard about, yes, but quite recently, because of the Israel attack on Iran, the price of crude oil increased a little bit from the $60 to almost $80 per barrel. So I'm not quite sure if still 45 it's a price cap. Before it was $70, but definitely it will be something between, maybe $50 as a price cap. So it's a mechanism which decrease the Russian revenues, but also somehow allowed other countries to buy Russian oil, because this is a problem. I mean, many countries like India, China, Turkey, they just buy Russian oil, and they didn't join the sanctions regime, right? Second issue is for Russian frozen assets. I mean, still there are many billion of US dollars of Russian reserves in European, US and Japanese central banks. And maybe G7 leaders also will decide something regarding how not only use interest rate of this money, but also confiscate all amounts.
So far they have failed to do so. Ursula von der Leyen is to meet with Donald Trump on the sidelines of G7. Now that the US has reached a consensus in negotiations with China, is it a good time to ask Donald Trump to do just the same with the EU?
I'm quite skeptical, and this is what I'm afraid of. The meeting between Ursula von der Leyen and Donald Trump probably will be the first meeting in person. Sometimes ago, Ursula von der Leyen said about not democratic standards in the United States in Paris during the international conference. And this conversation could be very difficult for both sides. I do not exclude some harsh statements made by Donald Trump. I hope that Ursula von der Leyen will be very calm, and if there will be some new information about new sanctions or, tariffs, not sanctions, but tariffs regarding European export and trade. I hope that it will be also just as statements, and we will wait a little bit. I think that there are other leaders, not only G7, but presidents or prime ministers of several countries who were invited as a guest, like Mexican president or Indian or South Africa. All these countries, they have very intense economic relation with United States and trade, and they really would like to influence Trump's mind, not just to play with tariffs as it was a few weeks ago. Probably this atmosphere and joint press conferences will be the most visible and most significant. I do not expect serious negotiation. I mean, US is pursuing the trade negotiation with negotiation teams, and with each country or with EU, they have separate track. During such a meeting like G7 summit plus, it's rather the time for a free conversation, and we should be very careful with words. Like during the last visit of German Chancellor to Washington DC or a French President, it's important to use words which would not provoke Donald Trump for some very harsh rhetoric. So this is what I expect from the G7 summit.
And about the very last of expectations, in one word, yes or no, can G7 work out a formula to stop the recent exchange of blows in the Middle East between Iran and Israel?
I don't think so. I think that for Israel is the unfortunately unique opportunity to hit Iranians right now because of the situation in Syria, in Lebanon, and they just want to, let's say, prevent Iranians from nuclear program, military program, and they are completely motivated to do this, and they are capable. So there is no political influence because this is only airstrikes, not a invasion which would cause a number of casualties. It's just a very precise attacks, and so far
we don't know what may follow.
Of course,
even though the two countries are not direct neighbors, strangest things may happen. Jarosław Ćwiek-Karpowicz, director of the Polish Institute of International Affairs, was our guest this evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching and stay with us for much more here on TVP World.